Everything is personal right here. Everything is personal right here. Everything is personal right here. Len and John rolling it up, listening as they change the industry.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another episode of Everything is Personal. As you will notice, there is no sound effect, and the reason why is that I'm solo today. Well, not quite solo, because I do have a very special guest. I'm going to try and attempt to pronounce my guest's name correctly. So let me see if this is my first actual question would be if I pronounce it correctly.
Okay.
So this is Dr. Karimet Aliffe.
Yep.
Close? Good?
Oh, yeah. They're very close. You did a lot better with my name than I do with yours.
Mine is way more difficult than yours.
It is.
So, Dr. Aliffe, thank you so much for joining us on Everything is Personal. You have a very long bio. Instead of reading it, because I find it boring, read people's bios, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay. Let's see. I got interested. As a kid, I was always interested in nature, understanding nature, and tended especially towards interest in chemistry and things on the molecular level. My mother died of metastatic breast cancer when I was 11 after being in and out of the hospital a lot for the last 3 years of her life. And so that guided my energies in a lot of different ways towards wanting to do research in cancer. And so when I went to college at Harvard, I ended up majoring in organic medicinal chemistry, looking at molecular mechanisms of cancer progression. And I carried that research forward when I went on to medical school at Stanford, and I was in the cancer biology MD PhD program, and continued to look at molecular mechanisms of cancer progression, referred to as tumor promotion. And other research that I did while I was at Stanford was also in clinical pharmacology. And again, it's kind of like looking at medicine at a molecular level, looking at how different drug molecules interact within the individual and also interact with one another when a person is taking more than one drug, as typically they are. And then as you expand that horizon a little bit, you start to realize that many of the foreign molecules that a human being is exposed to interact in drug-like ways. And so, some research that came out, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, 15 years ago now, that even, things like coffee and tea and grapefruit juice and, other fermented foods and barbecued meats and things can affect, for example, liver metabolism of drugs. So there's a lot of complexity that goes in there beyond what may just be injected or taken as a pill, as a prescription. And then when you expand out to natural medicines like cannabis, and you have, whether cannabis has upwards of 500 bioactive molecules, or if you look at something like psilocybin mushrooms that are not nearly as complex, and so they have easily less than 100. People usually just focus on psilocybin, but there are some other bioactives in there that can affect things like neurogenesis and all of that. But anyway, so all of those different aspects of my training helped me to be able to have a fairly unique perspective scientifically and then also personally, because of my mother's situation, and that's kind of my angle on medicine, is very human-centered. So I guess that's pretty much it. When cannabis came on board I guess it's been about 10, 12 years now, maybe, in Washington State where I am, then it was legal to start working in that space, even though it's still questionable, on the federal level and all that silliness, and professionally there's still issues, but the science is super compelling and fascinating. And my training in postgraduate training in medicine was in anesthesia, and anesthesia is basically psychotropic medicine. And so a lot of the skills and experience that I had in training in anesthesia are directly applicable to understanding the complexity of cannabis and also understanding things like facilitating psilocybin patients, or I've given people ketamine before in anesthesia and all that sort of thing. So anesthesia is really the only specialty in medicine that has such direct hands-on experience with direct administration of psychotropics.
You talk about traditional medicine. We had conversation in the past where I would refer to traditional medicine as medicine that comes in a pill that a doctor prescribes to you, but you have a sort of a different take on that. Maybe you can kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, so when I left Stanford, I was recruited away from Stanford to work for a biotech startup in Silicon Valley, and the model of that biotech startup was actually fairly unique. Was working in tropical rainforests with traditional healers. It used to be referred to as bioprospecting, and so traditions vary from culture to culture. And so when people refer to traditional medicine, even say traditional Chinese medicine or traditional medicine like Ayurveda from India, then so the terminology can get a little bit confused. And so, traditional then medicine is more looking to the historical practices, because that's typically what is connotated with the word tradition. And Western medicine, mainstream medicine, the medicine of pills and injections and vaccines and all of that is really more forward-looking, in the sense that the science keeps evolving, and what was true 2 years ago may not be true 5 years from now. There isn't a long-standing tradition of, let's say, antibiotics. Antibiotics are only about 50 years old. 100 years old if you go back to the very crude forms of them. So that's not such a long tradition. So just that distinction there. So, but yes, I've had experience with the traditional medicine practices, as well as I mentioned the Ayurveda. There's Taoist healing that I studied in Thailand and different things. So to really have a full spectrum understanding of what's going on for people when it comes to healing and what the greatest opportunities are.
Where did you grow up?
Well, at least you're giving me credit for being a grown-up.
We never want to grow up. I'm a big kid too. So. Let's say, where were you born and where were you raised? Is that a better way to phrase it?
Yeah. Well, this is anecdotal, mind you. Right. But yes, I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and grew up there until I was 17 when I left for college. So, but the evidence is inconclusive. All I have is a birth certificate, which, if I was to try and claim something like curing somebody of cancer, and I had just one little certificate, one piece of data, and saying, yes, I gave this patient cannabis and see, her cancer went away. That's anecdotal. So I consider my birth to be anecdotal.
Because you weren't present? There's no evidence.
Well, I was present, but I wasn't a trained observer at the time. And so skeptics would have to, disagree with any.
Well, there is a DNA test that exists. Have you ever thought about taking or have you taken a DNA test?
No, I haven't. I haven't taken it. Well, first I have to be sure I have DNA, but yeah. Well, that would be. Anyway, I'm going to stop.
You can track your ancestry and see.
Yeah, assuming I have ancestors. But yes, I could. I have never taken a DNA test so far, but it would be interesting to do so. I hear that you work with people that have DNA hanging around all the time.
Yeah, sometimes. I'm curious about Detroit, though. How was it growing up in Detroit? Were you because I don't know.
Oh, I lost your audio.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize. So I was saying that I'm not sure how just the internet connection is a little unstable. I was saying, but I'm not sure of how old you are, but I was, Detroit at a certain time was a very turbulent place. I'm a student of history, so I'm just kind of curious how it was growing up in Detroit in I don't know, late 60s, 70s, and that whole era, and then see if you can give me some insight on that.
Well, to the extent that I know the history of Detroit, you'd have to go back at least 100 years for it to not be turbulent. Um, so it was the bootlegging capital of the Midwestern United States in the 20s, and the car industry took off in the 50s and 60s, but then that led to a lot of labor disputes and a lot of criminal activity. Jimmy Hoffa probably would think that Detroit was a great place to live until it turned out to not be such a great place to live
For him.
And in the 70s that you mentioned, Detroit was a murder capital. And so it's, when you have that much big industry, you have that much income disparity, you have the usual social ills of the United States along multiple lines. There's a fairly large immigrant community there, and people from every place like Armenia and Lebanon and Latin America, all over the place. The largest Arabic-speaking population, at least say the largest Lebanese population outside of Lebanon, used to be in Detroit. It probably still is. So anyway, so there's lots of potentials there for conflict, but it's an big American city. There was always a lot of crime, and it just was the sort of thing where, especially gun crime, you just had to be very aware and be very present with people, and a smart person wouldn't say things that they didn't really mean. And I don't mean like, say, joking and things, but I'm talking with your friends, but I'm just saying, if somebody makes you angry, like, road rage kind of a thing, all this stuff they talk about, road rage, all these things that they talk about now, this is like old school. Like Detroit was the beta phase testing for at school shootings. Both of my parents were Detroit public school teachers, and they were shootings way back then. So, and road rage, these things didn't even have a name. And so in Detroit, you knew you don't honk at somebody. If somebody cuts you off, or you don't honk at them or flip them off, flip them the bird, or whatever the term is and all that, unless you're really ready to get down to business and get to know that person on a knuckle to knuckle level.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you just let it go.
Yeah, well, lucky it's knuckle because sometimes people pull out guns and everything. I'm from Philly.
You said boys and girls, so I'm kind of toning it down for boys and girls. Even though these days teenagers got a lot more going on than I ever did.
That is absolutely true. Yeah, no, I know, like Philly. I was raised in Philly, so it's sort of one of those towns too. And I remember like walking in LA, and I live in LA now, and you kind of say hello to people as you're walking down the street, nod and hello, and people answer you back, and never think anything of it. I went back to Philly and was hanging out with my friend. We went to a restaurant, ate, and it got late, and we consumed some cannabis walking down the street, and there was a guy walking towards us, and I sort of nod my head in acknowledgement, say hello, and he paused. He's like, "What's up?" I was like, "Oh, got it. I'm in Philly."
Right.
I forgot for a second. You're not supposed to engage with somebody like that, because that's what's going on.
It's communicating something completely different.
Exactly, completely different.
Yeah.
So when you were 17, did you then move? Did you go to Harvard at that time, or did you?
Yeah.
Okay, so you moved from Detroit to your university.
Cambridge. Yeah.
Cambridge, right?
Yeah.
Okay. How was that? Yep. How was that transition for you? I'm just curious.
It was bizarre.
Yeah.
It was bizarre because this is before the internet and all that sort of stuff, and so basically, as a kid, what you knew about was, where you lived. And, you can see other places on TV. So you can see California on a sitcom, or you can see Texas in an old Western or something. And I could see Vietnam and the war. But it doesn't mean you really know anything about it. If you saw China, it was in some Charlie Chan movie. So you didn't, even things like, I probably never saw fresh broccoli until I was in medical school. It was always frozen. Everything was bird's eye frozen foods, So going to other places, going to Boston was a shock, because like I was telling you, in Detroit, people are very, I guess I would say non-confrontational, um, except when they're meeting something really serious. And so people go out of their way to make sure, like, somebody steps on your foot, they will apologize right away. Quickest way to get shot in Detroit is to step on somebody's shoes and to not apologize. And so Boston's very the opposite. You know, you've probably seen comedians like Bill Burr or whatever. They've got a very much sort of an in your face, they call them townies, that sort of thing. That's a big part of Boston culture. And in Detroit, those people, it just, at least half of them would be dead, you know, because one half would kill the other half. It's just no way. So when I got there, I remember getting there on a bus and riding around, and just, first of all, the accent was super like harsh, like nails on a blackboard for my ears. And it's like, hey there, buddy, what the hell are you doing? Get on the bus. You're gonna take all day. Just throw that on the ground. You know, and I was like, whoa, what in the world? You know, and I started looking around, it's like, are people about to fight? You know, and they use a lot of profanity. And in, you know, in Detroit, people didn't use profanity unless it, like I said, people were ready to throw down. And so, you know, when people used the F word and all that kind of stuff, I was like, oh, you know, I need to get away. Because the thing is, you know, the rest of the world didn't learn about collateral damage until they created the term on CNN or whatever, and, you know, drive-by shootings in LA and all that sort of thing. But we knew in Detroit that most people that are running around shooting, that are criminals, you know, they don't train at the target range. And once the gunshot fires, that bullet could end up in anybody's body. And then, you know, and so as soon as you hear there's scream and some tires and what, and somebody, everybody hits the deck. It's like roaches, you know, you turn on the light and the roaches scatter. Is because until you know what's going on, you don't want to just be standing around looking. And that's how you can tell people are from out of town. They're like, what was that? They're still standing there. So anyway, so yeah, it was kind of like that. And so, but Boston is very different than Harvard. So Harvard, inside of the campus, it's just, you know, it's just very kind of small town, collegiate atmosphere, and people from off campus would wander through because it's not like an enclosed campus. It's not like Stanford. But, you know, kind of like in England, there's a big class distinction, you know, and people of different classes sound differently. There's a distinct difference between people, say, from South Boston or the North End, the way their back Boston accent sounds, and then somebody who, you know, is a college student who's, like, say, not even from Boston, or somebody who's from, what was it called? Nob Hill or Back Bay or whatever, the more affluent areas of Boston, is completely different sound. And so anyway, it's just, but the main thing for me as far as Harvard is Harvard being there. So I'm growing up, I went to a school for gifted children all the way from kindergarten through 12th grade. And when I graduated, and I completed school in 11 years instead of 12 because they, you know, double promoted me, whatever that's called. And I was recruited by MIT and Harvard when I was like 15 years old. And so the thing about going to the university really for me was this huge expansion of scope from the resources of a small private school to the resources of a university, and being able to be around a lot of people that had the same interest and people that knew a lot more than me about all sorts of things. And not just, you know, organic chemistry that I was interested in and working with grad students in the lab and all that, but people that knew all about, you know, I don't know, Shakespeare or something, or, you know, agriculture in Ireland in the 16th century or something, you know, and it's like, wow, this person knows that much about that thing. That's, you know, that's pretty impressive. I mean, it doesn't mean I'm going to have dinner with them every night, but, you know, so, because I've always had kind of an eclectic interest in human experience and what people do and what people do to one another and those sorts of things, and to just kind of understand how the world works and why things go wrong and how to fix those things when they go wrong.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And you, in your background, I think you also have you mentioned Thailand, and we spoke before and you have some history and background there. You have some history in the Congo, if I remember correctly,
Mm-hmm.
the Amazon. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
before I dive into that, was your goal always to be a healer? Because you wanted to be, did you want to be a doctor? Did you want to be a healer? Like what was your mindset? Because I know you mentioned your mom and all that, and
Mm-hmm.
I personally never wanted to be a doctor, but I always wanted to see how I can help people with plant medicine. I
Mm-hmm.
just don't think that I was ever, like looking at blood and all that stuff that wasn't in my DNA. Basically, I was just like, no, 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 no. If I see blood, man, I'm running the other way. So I just want to kind of get your mindset around that.
So I did a lot of biology and stuff when I was in high school. So I had done dissections on frogs and fetal pigs and things like that. I used to always, in my free time, the school that I went to was way out in the countryside. It had a little creek and things like that. So I used to get water samples and look at them under the microscope, when I had time off. And biology teacher, knew me very well. And, there were only a few classes during the day. So the biology lab was open for people to use. And unfortunately, I wasn't as my choices weren't as fortuitous as some of my friends, because we also had a computer room. It wasn't really a lab because computers were pretty new. But one of the guys who was, I guess, 2 years ahead of me, maybe 3 years ahead of me in school, yeah, and he ended up going to Harvard too. He was one of the first 20 employees at Microsoft, and now he's a billionaire. And so if I had been looking at computer programs instead of paramecia under the microscope, well, then, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation. So
Right.
I guess I win because he's a billionaire, but I get to talk to you. So obviously I made the
Big
better
win for
choice.
you. Big
Big
win.
win for me. So yeah, so I wasn't interested in being a doctor at all,
Mhm.
because a lot of the people that I went to school with, a lot of them were doctors' kids,
Mhm.
and a lot of the attitudes that they had bothered me. I remember, distinctly being on the bus going to school, and after Christmas, hearing kids complain about the Christmas gifts that they got, because it's like, I can't believe my father got me the wrong skis, and like, say, to put it in, current perspective, it's like, he got you an iPhone 10. Doesn't he know there's already a 12? You know, and it's like, yeah, my father likes to save money. Meanwhile, you got like a little flip phone from Target. and and
Right.
and so I it was unfortunate to me that the kids that were so fortunate, the school I went to was called Roper. It's called Roper School, and it's in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan.
Mhm.
And at the time, Bloomfield Hills was the most affluent zip code in the United States.
Mhm.
So more so than Beverly Hills, more so than the Hamptons in New York and all those other, fabled areas. And I guess because of the car industry was, such a big industry at the time. But
Mhm.
anyway, and so for people that had so much, my parents were teachers. They made like $25,000 a year. Our house was about that same price. And these people had mansions, and they were
Right.
still unhappy. And I thought it's an unfortunate thing. If a person who is affluent is unhappy, to me, that's tragic. It's tragic to be poor and unhappy, but most people that are poor think that they'll be happy if they have more money. So there's hope, at least the lottery.
Right.
But if you've already got $1 million and you're not happy, you've already had all the plastic surgery that you could have and you're still not happy, that's kind of a dead end. And
Yeah.
and so anyway, like I said, I pay attention to the human condition in a lot of
Mhm.
different states, and that's one of those things. Most people don't feel sorry for anybody who's affluent or wealthy or handsome or whatever, but a lot of times people that are in that situation are very troubled, and you just don't see it until they end up, ODing on something somewhere and it shows up in the newspaper. But so yeah, the my interest was in science, and specifically chemistry and the chemistry of biology and things like that. But when I was a senior in high school and right at the end of senior year, so people were asking me, so what was I going to do in college? And I used to tell people that I was planning to major in biology and then go on and do a PhD in biology because I wanted to do cancer research. And there's one guy whose father was a doctor. Um, when he heard me say that, he told me, he's like, oh, well, you'll have to go to medical school to do cancer research, because it involves patients. You won't be able to do research as a PhD.
Hmm.
And I thought he was right because he acted like he was right, and his father was a doctor. So I was like, okay, well. So then when I went to college, I was pre-med and was majoring in biology first, because it's just, again, like I said, you don't, as a kid, I mean, now, like I said, with the internet, you can basically learn anything sitting in your bathroom, but to know that there's so much involved in cancer, to know that there's so much to health beyond biology. And, when I was at Harvard, the biochemistry department didn't even exist yet. It was still a division of the chemistry department. So things like molecular biology and all of these other things that are present now, DNA sequencing and all that hadn't happened yet. So I had a lot to learn about what cancer is and what it took to study cancer and what it took to understand it, and ultimately found out that biology was really the wrong path, because biology at the time was very rudimentary. It didn't have anything, like I was saying, nothing was molecular about biology at the time except for DNA. And their way of explaining things was very sort of rinky-dink explanation. It was this one day in class where they were teaching DNA replication and how when a cell divides, how is the DNA in the cell replicated, how are the copies made. And again, this is a long time ago, so the average person never talked about DNA like they do now. People say, "Oh, it's the DNA of our corporation." I guess that's just part of my DNA. It's become part of vernacular, but back then, And anyway, the professor is teaching this class, and he's saying, so inside of the nucleus, the DNA unwinds, and DNA polymerase, which is the enzyme that copies the DNA strand to make a new DNA strand. It walks along the DNA strand until it finds the initiator sequence, and then it sits down there and it reads the DNA and begins copying it. And I was horrified. I put my pencil or pen or whatever I was taking notes with. Here I am paying all this money because I paid my way through school. Here I am paying all this money, and this person is telling me that DNA polymerase, this enzyme, this molecule, walks, it sees, it sits, and it makes copies. And if he can't tell me, okay, what's the mechanism of how it walks? How is a molecule able to see? Okay, and how is it going from walking to sitting? If you can't tell me that, you'd better not that same week I changed my major from biology to chemistry, because in chemistry, you get the feeling that you know everything, because you got two dots on a piece of paper, you draw a circle and make an arrow, and these two electrons from the oxygen go over here and they attack the carbon, and they go in this little bubble of the electron density of the molecular orbitals of carbon. And so then you now have a chemical bond between the oxygen and the carbon. It's like, okay, there it is. And then you can verify it with the NMR or spectroscopy or whatever. And I was like, okay, these people know what they're talking about. And so the other stuff, it was just
made a lot more sense.
Yeah, it made a lot more sense, because it's one of those things. One of the big challenges that I faced, so here's something for the kids, was my parents were always very straightforward. Our house was a very, very straightforward, flat relationship house. The parents were responsible, but they weren't superior. And the school I went to was that way too. So, like we would play Scrabble, and if you put a word down, and just if the parents said, "Oh, that's not a word," my brother was really big with words. My brother ended up working at, NASA JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He was smarter than me, I would say. And anyway, but if you could show it's in the dictionary, then it's a word. It wasn't like, well, your father said this, well, your mother said that. We didn't have any of that. Whatever you said, you had to be able to prove it. And in fact, when I was in medical school at Stanford, my girlfriend at the time, my fiance, actually, she was in law school. And when I would go to parties with her, all of her law student friends were like, "You should be a lawyer. You're more like a lawyer than I am." It's just because I was used to making a point that was a defensible point and knowing how to defend the point, and also how to dismantle someone else's argument. And I just was used to doing that because of the people I was around, the schools I went to. But basically, it was part of the core function, of my house. My house, even though, as Eddie Murphy used to say, I came from a predominantly black family, it wasn't like the black families you see on TV. It wasn't like the movies like Soul Food or whatever, all these other TV shows that they have. My parents were both school teachers. They had grown up in the Depression, and they were serious about, you'd better get in there and, get your work done, get your homework done, because you've got to go to college, because that's the opportunity. As an African American kid in the United States, education is the key. You know,
Mm.
and you're not going to get any place if you don't know what you know and know how to express what you know, that sort of a thing. So anyway, so that's just
I like how
me.
you said that your brother went to NASA, the Jet Propulsion Lab, and he's smarter than you. You're a real underachiever, I think, with going to Harvard and Stanford. That's really interesting. But I kind of touched on it for a minute about having this. To me, you're sort of you have all such an eclectic background, because when we talk and I mentioned, I just said Thailand, you're like, oh,
Hmm.
I speak some Thai, and I know Thai, and spending some
Hmm.
time in these, like, how did this journey evolve where you were in these different countries, you were able to get the local flavor and bring that into some of the areas of interest that you have now.
Well, even when I had very limited horizons, as a kid in Michigan, as a kid in Detroit, I always had very diverse experiences. So the school that I went to was a very, very diverse school. There were Italian kids and Polish kids, and about 20% of the school was Jewish. The school was started by a couple from Germany whose family had run private schools there in Germany, but they left right at the beginning of World War II. The wife was Jewish, the husband was Christian, and that's how he was able to get her and her family out to avoid the Holocaust thing. And so they had a very humanist perspective because of what they had been through and also what they escaped going through. And so they were very like multicultural minded long before the words like diversity and multicultural and all that existed. And so, there were kids that were Puerto Rican or that were Mexican or Japanese or Chinese or whatever. Just there were all these different, and there were kids that were wealthy, and there were kids that were poor, and there were black kids that were rich, and white kids that were poor, and white kids that were rich, and black kids that were poor. And when I say poor, I don't mean poor like homeless poor, like now people talk about, but just in the sense that their parents may not have a steady job or whatever, they were at the school on scholarship or some sort of thing like that.
Right.
And so there were always these multiple contexts. To me, the world was very diverse, non-uniform, very heterogeneous. And so somebody might say, oh, you're a black guy from Detroit, and they think that means something. It's like, yeah, it doesn't really mean a whole lot. It's like, depends on are you from the east side or from the west side? Are you from north of 7 Mile Road? Are you from Sherwood Forest? Are you from the projects? There's a lot of different things, and people that are from this part of town don't go over there. It's like telling somebody that they're Italian. It's like, okay, Italian. So in Philly and in New York City and in Boston, that's all very different, right? And you can't just roll up into Queens in New York coming from Philly. Hey, Italian guys, I'm Italian. Come. They're like, we don't know you. If you don't already know us, don't come in being our brother. You need to walk in through the, new guest entrance door until you get some local credibility. And so anyway, so I that's one of the things that I recognize, that there are lots of different types of people within those types. That not all Jewish people are the same, and not all Italians are the same, and obviously not all people that are called white or black or Asian or whatever are the same. And I always wanted to understand where I was, so understanding the culture and even the language much of the time was really important. And my father was very much that way. And so we used to go to a lot of different, what they used to call ethnic restaurants back then, like Greek food. There's a Greek town in Detroit that's very famous. And there's a lot of Arabic restaurants right there in the Greek town. And whenever we would go to these places, he knew a few phrases. He knew how to say at least hello or thank you or whatever in all these different languages. We used to buy our meat from a kosher Jewish deli and all these things. My brother's godmother was Jewish, you know, so there was a lot of this cultural interchange that was available. And so kind of expanding to, you know, to Boston and California and then to other countries. I took an interest in Thailand primarily because Thai restaurants started showing up, and then a friend of mine actually that I had gone to high school with was in a movie in Thailand, a movie called Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams.
Right.
And Robin Williams actually went to school just about 5 miles away from my school. He went to Detroit Country Day. And anyway, so and that view of the world for me, I guess, is what allows me to just continue adding new pieces to the puzzle, new Legos to the building or whatever, because it's just, Thailand is just another neighborhood that you can't get to on the local bus. You know, you got to take a transfer. You know what I'm saying? Because you know, there's like places you can go, you can hop on your bike and you go here, go there. You know, I'm sure it's the same feeling, whatever. But there's this point that you don't cross.
Right.
Could be a river. You know, Detroit's right across the river from Canada and Windsor, Canada. So I never went there on my bike. I would go there with my parents. Okay, but there's this point beyond which you don't go, either because it's a hostile neighborhood or because there's a natural boundary. Maybe there's a freeway. Your parents tell you to not cross the major street or whatever. But then once you can cross those boundaries, then that's just the place that was on the other. So Thailand is just really a couple neighborhoods away from Detroit, you know, and sure, they speak different language and all that. But, you know, when you went to Hamtramck, which is just outside of Detroit, there were lots of Polish businesses there. It was a big Polish population there. Another language. So it's the idea that people would be different than me was always a primary principle. I didn't expect to be like other people, and nobody ever treated me like I was part of the group. I never fit in with any group, because going to private school and having two parents that were teachers, when I would spend time in the neighborhood where I lived, like say in the summertime, and you know, playing ball and football in the street and baseball in the park and all that, everybody in my neighborhood knew that I didn't go to public school with them because I didn't speak the same way.
Got it.
And so it just they would always tell me, you talk like you're white, you know, and I didn't actually learn how to speak and sound Black until I saw it on TV. You know, like when that became popular in the 80s or whatever, and Samuel L. Jackson, people like that sort of caricature, because not everybody Black speaks that way. But that tone, you know, it was like learning a foreign language, you know, and so I can imitate that sound, you know, but it's just so there's just different ways that I'll speak depending on who I'm speaking to.
Right.
And it's a very funny thing that happens if I'm around, say, Caribbean people, because I used to play soccer a lot back when soccer was not so much of a popular American sport. And so that was also a very international experience. And when I would, you know, get the sound in my ear of different accents and people speaking English, it would affect immediately the way I speak, because I just was so used to, you know, adapting and changing languages and changing vernacular and all that with people. And it was advantageous in soccer, because one day when I was at Harvard and just playing a pickup game, and you know, you call for the ball, it's like, ball, hey, pass, you know, pass, cross, whatever, all these phrases to I'm open, and the ball would never come. And I would notice it because it was mostly foreign guys, and they would pass to other foreign guys. It wouldn't even necessarily be from the same country. Some Nigerian guy might pass to a guy from Argentina or whatever. And I was like, huh. And then something clicked in my head. And so I started saying, ball, I'm open, ball, pass. And boom, the ball would show up right away. And I'm like, oh, okay, now I know what's going on.
That's hysterical.
Yeah. So it's a fun thing to me to understand what it means to be human, because it also helps to decode a lot of the BS that we're fed as Americans. It's on TV. and people get on TV or on the radio and start talking about we. Well, we know now that, the black hole in the center of the galaxy is actually not the reason for climate change. And what we know about COVID and what we know about Canada, everybody's saying is we. Who's we? I don't know you. Are you going to tell? And, all of us, agree that, the oil wells need to just, and it's just, it's an arrogant sort of speech. It makes my, skin cringe or whatever the phrase is. And
it's the sheep mentality. Everybody's that are
it
trying
is. It's crazy. It's crazy. But even a sheep will look at you if you get out there and start talking about we. You're just like she's like,
not us.
You sleep indoors, so let's not let's not play the games here. So anyway, so just there are lots of things that I understand better, like say in psychotropic medicine and anesthesia. There's a lot of differences between individual responses to drugs. And there are some ethnic differences sometimes that are evident, and people would say, oh, like Asian women are very sensitive to opiate drugs and even into sedatives, and so you might want to cut the dose in half. And so a lot of times you realize that you might be looking at a woman as, say, who's 35 years old, as just a woman. And you may not notice that at the same height, maybe that this one has a lot more body fat, this one has less body fat. So like a lot of times, Asian, especially younger Asian women have a lot less body fat than Americans do. But if you don't pay attention to that, you're not paying attention to some of the parameters that are relevant for, administration of drugs, especially in anesthesia. You're doing these things milligram per kilogram, IV push, and suddenly that drug's on board. And if they're not metabolizing the drug as fast as the other person over there, and then also sometimes people, their complaint about pain and then their experience of anything in that emergency room, operating room, intensive care unit space. Some cultures complain more, some complain less. And some people will never tell you something hurts. And some people will tell you something hurts the minute you walk in the door. And so to understand really what's going on, because ultimately then I'm responsible. If I shoot 100 micrograms of fentanyl into that person's IV and they stop breathing, I've got to be able to explain to somebody, well, why'd you give them, so much? They're not even going to know, ask how much I did. It's like, well, it was just 100 micrograms. Well, it was obviously too much because they're not breathing, And so you've got to be able to explain what was your thought process. And, coming from the household I came from, that's easy for me to explain. But I also recognize that if I used to get in trouble actually in my residency because I would question people because I don't have that natural deference that most people have because I wasn't raised with it. And so it doesn't matter if I'm talking to somebody older than me or younger than me, somebody with a degree or not a degree. A person is a person, and I talk to people typically on a very flat, direction. Unless they're trying to talk down to me, then I'll try sometimes if I feel like it, do tung fu and kind of chop them down a little bit. But I've met the president of India, and different places. I've been in situations to meet people that are dignitaries or whatever. But to me, a person's a person, and it's just like, who is this person and what are they saying? And so the professors, at Stanford, they were just people, and especially they weren't that much older than me because anesthesia faculty, they tend to run kind of young. They tend to be like in their 40s, and coming out of medical school, I was in my 20s. But I remember the chairman of the department coming in one time and saying to me, it's like, oh, I wouldn't do that way if I were you. And I was like, okay. And he didn't say anything else. And so I kept doing what I was doing. He said, oh, well, I said I wouldn't do it that way. I said, well, you didn't tell me any other way to do it. So I've done it this way all along, and he was like, well, you're in training, aren't you open to learning? And I was like, well, in order to learn, you got to tell me what it is that I'm supposed to learn. But the last person on your faculty that I worked with yesterday did it this way, and so, but other people, they're like, oh, really? What did I do wrong? Well, I know I didn't do anything wrong. I don't do things that are wrong. I almost never do anything wrong. And that might sound like an arrogant thing, but you can make a mistake. That's not wrong. Wrong is when you do something and you threw the Kleenex over the trash can and it missed, and you didn't bother to get up and pick it up. And my mom walks in the room. She says, "Is that your Kleenex?" I did something wrong. Okay. Because I know that Kleenex sitting on the floor is not the right thing. The right thing to do is to get up, walk over, put it in the trash can, and come back, and not try and be, basketball superstar and throw it in there from 10 feet away. And so that's wrong. Okay. But if I walk into somebody's house who's Japanese and I'm walking wearing my shoes and I don't know that they take off their shoes, that's not wrong because nobody's given me that set of rules. We don't have a
Right.
contract yet. Okay.
Yep.
And so anyway, so those sorts of things. So I have a lot of confidence in the things that I'm doing because I've already thought about what I'm doing before I do it. And I also don't feel responsible for new bodies of information that have not been presented to me. I don't have that natural sense of, I hear people apologize all the time for things that they can't control. I don't apologize for things that I can't control. And, people, like you go to a store and somebody, "Oh, I'm so sorry. The computer's really slow today." And I think that's terrible that anybody should have to have all of those crazy neurotransmitters in their brain, making them less happy, making them depressed, depressing their immune system, and making them age faster just because I'm standing there waiting for them to print out a receipt. I'm not asking for them to be stressed. I think it's a terrible thing that people do to themselves. And so I usually, but because I've kind of learned about people and how to speak to people and people that are outside of a laboratory, and I just tell them, I said, "Oh, don't worry, computers, they make mistakes too, but what's funny? They never get fired." And then if you're like, isn't that the thing? And then suddenly, and then they get a little laugh. And so that was one of my professors in anesthesia when he wrote my recommendation letters. That was one of the things he said, that I had a very disarming sense of humor. And I didn't realize at the time that that was such an important thing. Because again, like I said, I was in my 20s. And I didn't realize that adults, and especially sometimes adult males, are so competitive. And so competitive in like a destructive way, like they're hoping other person will fail. They want to be able to point something out or laugh at them. And I came from a very non-competitive background because it was a humanist school. Even though we had sports and all that, it wasn't usually about hurting somebody unless they were trying to hurt you first or whatever. But even though I was in Detroit, that's the murder capital, but it's like, look, unless I'm in a battle situation, I'm not trying to harm anybody. I want everybody to win.
Yep.
And I used to have a terrible time playing intramural basketball because my best friend growing up, if he was on the other team, I don't want him to lose. He's my best friend. He's making a shot. I want it to go in. I want it to go in just as much as he does. I don't want to block his shot. That's my friend. And so it's, I know it's a little bit unusual characteristic for people to have, and so I had to learn how to manage that sort of a thing. But anyway, so it's just, for me, it's a lot about understanding these circumstances that people find themselves in. Because when you get into something as complicated as psychotropics, you're really looking at, it's like, so what's going to make this person feel better? It's not some sort of Dear Abby, blog person, whatever, generic advice. People think if you take a homeless person, give them a home and a bath, some clothes, and $500, they'll be better. It's like, no, you really don't understand what that means. There's something more going on. It's that quick fix mentality. If I just inject you with this, $10,000 loan, you'll turn into a normal person. It's like, if you respect a person, you might realize that they're probably there for a reason. And there are things in this world that can really, really get to a person to the point where they just can't cope. And you should really just be happy that they didn't show up at their old workplace or at the post office shooting people or at the park. And that they just kind of, took it out on themselves and, are sleeping in the street or whatever. But there's a lot of things that can take a person out in this world. And if they don't end up homeless, and they're still holding it together to be mom or dad or employee or whatever, sometimes it's even more complicated because maybe inside they're homeless. Their spirit, their soul might be completely, boom, disenfranchised, but they're trying to keep it together. And if that person presents and says they've got, back pain, they've got PTSD, or they've got anxiety or depression or whatever, it can be a huge Pandora's box if you think that everybody is supposed to look the same on the inside, like, like a anatomy atlas,
Yeah.
and to just be able to peel away those layers and continue to help people and not do any harm.
Yeah.
There's at least as much art to it as science, and I usually favor the art over the science.
Yeah, no, I think it's a brilliant way of putting it, and it sort of goes along with what the show is called. Everything is personal. We
Hmm.
talk about everybody has a personal experience. It's personal. It's health and wellness. Everything is personal. So I definitely appreciate you talking about that. I have a few questions that we ask all our guests. Very very complicated questions. So I'm
Sure.
very ready for these, and then we'll let you get on your way to something way more important than this. I'm sure that's just about anything else in your day except for
Have
this.
to go feed the squirrels.
There we go. That's even more important. All right. Please describe your first experience with cannabis.
Oh gosh, I thought you were going to say sex. I was. It's
That's
so
the
hard
other
for me to remember
podcast.
because I was 9 years old, and it's anyway. No, my first experience with cannabis. Wow. Okay, my first experience with cannabis. My brother was 7 years older than me, and he went away to college. When he came back from college, he went to Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, Ohio, and he used cannabis frequently. And of course, at the time, it was still illegal,
Mhm.
and that created a lot of hassle between him and my father. And at that time, again, kind of like the little narrow, Detroit kids' view of the world, marijuana was something that hippies did. It was invented then. It didn't have any history. The plant didn't even exist on the face of the earth prior to the 1960s. And so, oh, are we still there? Great. Oddly enough, I just got a call from Dr. Jake Felice. Isn't that funny? Anyway, and so I didn't know that Louis Armstrong smoked marijuana like every day. Um, and so learning about cannabis, and again, like, it's personal, like what are different people's way of relating to it and all these different things. And so and at my school there were kids that used smoke weed, whatever, often hiding off in the bushes and that sort of thing, I guess. And I was never part of that crowd, but people always, when I was 16, people always used to ask me, was I high? Because I used to be very kind of relaxed and like, hey, how's it going, and all that. And and people were like, are you high? Are you high? And I didn't understand, because I didn't even know what it meant. And I never actually, my brother tried to get me to smoke weed with him, but I didn't like smoking anything, cigarettes or any of that kind of stuff, because I tried smoking cigarettes and to impress a girl. She was pretty though. And
Did it work?
anyway, her name was Linda. And but anyway, and I met her on the porch of her house, and she asked, my friend and I were riding our bikes. I guess I was 13. I think, yeah, I was 13. And did we have a cigarette? And we didn't have any cigarettes. And she was like, oh, okay. So it was obvious, like, you can come hang out with me on my porch, but you got to come up here with some cigarettes. I was like, oh,
Exactly.
wow. She's pretty fine, though. So my friend, he knew all about cigarettes. He's like, we'll be right back. And we went down the street. He went to the corner drugstore, bought a pack of cigarettes and cool filter Kings,
Yeah.
and came back. And that's how we got to meet. But we used to go back there every couple of days or so and just hang out, and everybody would have a cigarette. And she was younger than us. My friend probably was a year older than me, so he's probably 14. And I'd seen people smoke on TV, and so I knew how to do it. So I thought. And one day she said to me, "It's like, you don't inhale, do you?" Like, what do you mean? She said, "Inhale. You're not inhaling. You're just sucking smoke in and blowing it out." I was like, "Yeah, that's what it looks like on TV. You see them go
Right.
when they blow it out." And to find out that people were actually inhaling smoke in their lungs. And so she was like, "You have to inhale it." I was like, "Really?" I was like, "Okay." When I inhaled it, it was like horrible. And I was like, and they were menthol cigarettes too. And it's like, oh my God, this is terrible. And so after that, I never even pretended to smoke. And when I got to college, all my roommates smoked weed in the dorm room. And one guy was from Philly, and one guy was from the suburbs of Chicago, and the other guy was from New Hampshire. And big guy, he's like 6'5". He's the director of the Museum of Natural History now in New York. He's like an astrogeologist or some sort of thing like that. He's a really brilliant guy. He worked on the first Mars rover landing or some sort of thing like that. But anyway, so everybody was always trying to get me to smoke, and I was like, no, And everybody I knew had already gotten high. My girlfriend at the time, she was very meek and shy, but she had tried marijuana in high school. And this guy who was trying to be my best friend and always wanted to hang out and go to movies and stuff, he said that he had tried it in high school, but none of them, actively smoked. But probably my best friend in college, this guy named, I shouldn't say his name because he's still a practicing physician. He ended up going to Harvard Medical School. He smoked weed, marijuana every night at 10 p.m. At 10 p.m., no matter what we had to do, he didn't do all-nighters for studying. He was a bright guy. He didn't have to work that hard. And so every night at 10 p.m., close the notebooks and the books, roll the joint. He would talk to me about Thai stick and Maui and all this. He was like, smell this bag. I've got it in the refrigerator. Look how green it is. Look how, this is back, with street weed, it's not like, dispensaries and all that now. And he was like the serious connoisseur of the herb, as he used to like to call it. And so I thought that was very cool. And he always did very good. And he would get blazed, as they used to call it back then. And his eyes would get red and all that. And so eventually I realized, because my brother also, like I said, was an active marijuana smoker. And I thought, I should try this just to see what it is. Because there's so many issues on both sides. Mm-hmm. There's so many people that think it's great, like wonderful, it's simple, like having a beer. And I didn't drink alcohol because I didn't like the taste of alcohol. But it's really, no different than drinking. And to other people, it's like, no, it's this awful thing. You should never do it. But it wasn't like cocaine sort of thing or heroin. It wasn't like these so-called hard drugs that people would get addicted to and that they would ruin their lives and all these terrible things happen. So I never tried any of those. But I thought, okay, I'll try it. Because by this time, back then, people used to keep, except for my friend, who was a connoisseur, kept his in a Ziploc bag in the refrigerator, but everybody else used to keep it in these film canisters.
Yep.
By the time I'd been, this was like my second semester of my freshman year. So by the time I'd been in college for, I guess by that point, like 8 months, 9 months, this is probably like March or April of my freshman year. Mm-hmm. I probably had 2 or 3 film canisters of weed because people were always giving it to me. They were just like, what? And so they would think, oh, he probably doesn't want to get high around people. He doesn't want people to know or something. But people were just always giving me stuff, And the one friend that I had who went on to be the director of the Museum of Natural History, he used to smoke hash because his family had money, so he could pay for hash. I didn't know there was a price difference, but I didn't know anything about the difference. I just knew that it was all marijuana. And so he would like give me, it's like, well, here, just take this. It's already at the bottom. It's just a little bit left. But just one day, if you ever decide. And so I had all these little canisters that were filled with different stuff that people were giving me. So there was a little hash in there. There was a little Maui. Who knows what else was in there? So one day I decided I was going to try with my girlfriend. And I got somebody, I don't know who it was, maybe one of my roommates, to let me use their bong. And I was a big fan of another guy from Philly back then, Bill Cosby. And our whole family was big fans of his. We used to listen to his records.
I went to the same university. I went to Temple.
I know. I wasn't going to mention it since you weren't going to mention it. I was going to let you mention that. But back when he was still an American hero. Right. But anyway, he had this one routine that he used to do that was like not the family routine, but the Las Vegas routine. Mm-hmm. And the routine was, he said that, talking about different drugs, he said, but you know what? People that do, maybe he called it reefer probably or something. Mm-hmm. Interesting thing about slang terms for marijuana. I just learned from a friend of mine dad as a, also I worked with in the rainforest in the Amazon. His name's Mark Plotkin, big celebrity guy in rainforest conservation. He's from Louisiana. And one of the slang terms for marijuana in Louisiana is muggle. Is, and so I thought, I wonder if the muggles that they're talking about in Harry Potter, they don't have witchcraft, but they've got weed, Anyway, that's for the boys and girls. Anyway, so so I borrowed this bong, but anyway, so Bill Cosby in his routine would talk about the people that get high on marijuana, they work harder than anybody else. He's like, yeah, if you want to get drunk, you have, 2 or 3 shots or whatever, and boom, there you are. He says, but marijuana, they light it up and then they inhale, and then they have to hold it, and they hold it, and they do it, and then they take another breath. Bill Cosby likes to exaggerate everything, but in listening to that, then I was like, oh, okay, so that's what you need to do. That was my instruction manual. A lot of times people, when they're smoking recreationally, a lot of people report that, oh, they never got high the first time or the second time when they smoked, it didn't have any effect and all that. And I've always been a very efficient person. So I made sure that I had efficient techniques. So I had this bong and I had it loaded with who knows what was in there, half hash, half marijuana, whatever it was. And I'm holding my breath as long as I can. Everybody else is just smoking and blowing it out. And I do a little smoke, I'll suck it back in. So it only took me about 3 hits. And boom, then the effect took place. And it was interesting. I started to have like a little, giggly feeling and laughing. I knew about those because I've been around people smoking all the time because, like I said, everybody was smoking weed and everything. But there was this one effect that really, really surprised me. And I guess people call it a buzz or a rush or whatever, but it was like this feeling that came up over my back and up my neck and over the top of my head that was like all tingly and everything. And I was like, oh my God, I recognize this feeling. That feeling is a feeling I used to always get as a kid whenever I shared my toys. My parents are really big on sharing. You have company, you have guests in your house, you have to share. You got a peanut butter sandwich, give them half of it. You've got, your favorite toys or whatever, let them play with your toys. Don't be selfish. And so I had to. But the side effect of it, which I didn't expect to have happen, was so, on Sunday after church, and a bunch of my friends come over because their parents come over to visit my parents or whatever. And we're downstairs playing with Army Man, G.I. Joe, whatever, all that kind of stuff. And I'm letting them play with these toys. And I could feel this huge tingle. And it was like almost like, well, I could say it's like a semi-trance hypnotic state or something. I was just like, wow. And I wouldn't even play. I would just let them play. They were like, hey, you can have the bazooka. And I'm like, oh yeah, you go ahead. And so years later with the marijuana, I was like, wow, people spend all this money and hide and do all these things and smoke this stuff to get the same feeling I used to get when I was 9 years old. And I would, share my toys with kids. I was like, wow, that's really funny. So for me, that's like the most standout memory of psychotropics and all of that I've had the same experience other times and without any drug being involved. And so for me, being like this molecular neurochemistry minded person, it's like, wow, so all this stuff is really inside of people. That's the one thing I think that people tend to forget. I used to do these lectures about the mind and neurochemistry and all that to different, to like lay audiences like patients and sometimes to doctors. I said, remember that the drug isn't really causing anything because every effect that any drug has is already a system in the body. And so, everybody knows about the endocannabinoid system and all those things, but people kind of forget that it's the body doing it. It's like the drug is just giving permission, so you put whatever, I guess it's not a quarter anymore. You put $1 or whatever in a vending machine and you hit a button and out comes a can of Coke or whatever, a bag of chips or something like that. That capacity is already in that machine. You just had to trigger it. So $1 bill does not create a soda or create a bag of potato chips. that machine already has that potential. So that means, somebody who takes MDMA, so it hits serotonin receptors, it activates oxytocin and norepinephrine and all that. All of those chemicals are what creates the effect.
Right.
The ecstasy is just saying, it's like a recipe. It's saying, look, you've got all of these ingredients, all of these spices. I do a lot of cooking. My mom taught cooking, so I've been cooking ever since I was 6, and cooking and chemistry are like the same thing. And so you might have all of these different, spices, salt and pepper and cumin and garlic powder and onion powder and turmeric, and maybe you're going to make curry and cinnamon and nutmeg and allspice and ginger. Okay, you can make a lot of different types of food with that. You can make chai tea, Indian style tea. You can make garam masala. You can make Jamaican jerk pork or chicken. And these spices are in a lot of different types of foods. It just depends on how you combine them. And so it's the same thing with the neurotransmitters, depending on, what state of mind you want to enter in. That state of mind has a chemical fingerprint, a neurochemical fingerprint. And the drug is just very good at going directly there. It's like there are certain people that when they come to a party, everybody gets into that party mode. It's like, oh yeah, well, wait till Lynn gets here. Lynn, he's the party dude, man. When everybody shows up, it'll be like, yeah, oh yeah. Suddenly, just the party starts happening. Exactly. But until then, the exact same people are there. The music is playing, but it's kind of like 60% party. Like, people are thinking of leaving, and people think that person was the party, but the party was already there. Everybody had that capacity to hit that state.
Right.
People that get high to party. That's what I used to think was so amazing. He was like, oh, yeah, we're going to have a great time. We're going to do a bunch of shots and we're going to hit the bong and we're going to have a great time at this concert, this party. And I used to tell people, you must be really boring. How could you possibly go to, one of these spring break parties on South Beach, or go to some amazing club in LA, or go to some concert, your favorite band is, in concert, whoever it is, Prince or, whatever, I don't know, whoever's supposed to be a big deal, Kanye, or these people that go to these concerts. How could you not be excited? How could you actually need something else? How could you possibly need something else? How boring are you that you need to get drunk or you need to get high in order to enjoy Star Wars or the light show, the fireworks? I always thought that was weird.
Yeah.
But then I realized it was me that was weird, because I could just share my toys and boom, fireworks are going off in my head. But the key thing about psychotropic medicines and mushrooms, psychedelics and all of that is they're like that party person.
Yeah.
The party is available inside of each of us. That state of mind, you can go from depression to euphoria. You can go from anxiety to calm and all that. And whether a person uses a exogenous substance like a drug, a molecule, a plant, a mushroom, or if they use a technique like breathing or meditation, it's about being able to hit that target space, that state of mind that you want to be in order to live your life, or to, go to a concert or go to a job interview or whatever that is. And so that's the thing that to me is super fascinating, is that it's really not this thing. It's really not THC. That's not what's happening. It's really not psilocybin. It's not MDMA. It's not LSD. It's not DMT. It's that person and who they could be. And the most amazing thing that I learned in anesthesia is, and I realized somebody had said it before, I saw some quote somewhere, I thought I was the first one to say it, but that basically all of us have 12 personalities inside of us, 11 of which we don't know. And how a lot of people's like, oh yeah, after he's had 3 beers, he turns into so you might know that, this person has 2 personalities when he's at work, and then that when he's at the bar, the sports bar after work. But that same person, you put them in the operating room and you give them these drugs to go to sleep, and this certain personality comes out, especially when they wake up. But if you give them these other drugs like Diprovan, the one that Michael Jackson OD'd on, they wake up completely different. It's almost like you gave them ecstasy or something. They wake up like, hi, you're so wonderful. Oh gosh. And so to realize that, well, they all went into the same state, technically. They went into stage 3 anesthesia or whatever. They had, surgical anesthesia. They had, some GI surgery, some, invasive surgery, major surgery. And then they come out And so it shouldn't matter what drug you put them into that state. You could assume because they're asleep, think you hit them in the head, they don't wake up, they don't move, whatever. They come out, depending on which drug you use to put them in that state, they've still got a little bit of drug on board when they come out. That determines what state of mind they're in. I've, worked with veterans, like Marine Corps colonels, and they're like, yep, I'm here to have my finish up today. They're like that, And then afterward, they're like, hi, Dr. Aliffe, thank you so much. Thank you. I didn't tell you how much, did I ever tell you have the most amazing brown eyes? It's like, whoa. Colonel from the Marines is like, hitting on me or what?
Right.
Hello, ladies and stuff. I just want to give you a kiss, And it's like Diprovan. They used to call it mother's milk and a lot of other slang terms, but there's a lot of potential inside of each person that typically we don't go down into that part of ourselves because maybe we don't feel we have permission in the world.
Yeah, I mean, such a great description. I completely appreciate you really talking about that. The substance that we put inside of us, it just triggers our own neurochemistry. I mean, it's a great way of describing it. Dr. Aliffe, I just want to say thank you so much for your time.
Can I pop one more thing?
Yeah.
Can I pop one more thing? It's super quick.
Thing. Yeah.
So if all of these neurotransmitters, these neurochemical spaces are available to everybody, and that psychotropics can shift people. That's what psychotropic means. It means tropic means to turn the psycho, the mind. It turns to a different perspective, a different angle, a different perspective on the world. Okay. Consider that the most commonly consumed psychotropics in the world are caffeine and nicotine. So what would the world be like if we had a caffeine holiday or a caffeine and nicotine holiday? I'm not talking about withdrawals and all that. I know people are addicted, but just think that drug puts people in a certain state.
Yep.
It doesn't make them more friendly. Okay. It doesn't make them violent necessarily, but it does make them more friendly. If we just took people down just to basic air and water state, as opposed to all these substances, even without the cannabis, the whole world would probably change just by subtracting nicotine. If we lived in a world where the go-to psychotropic was cannabis, or kava instead of nicotine and caffeine, wow, the whole world would be different. Of course, all the caffeine people say, yeah, you wouldn't get any work done. Kava and cannabis, why we'd all be sitting on the beach like a bunch of, Pacific Islanders. And I'm like,
I'm sure there's a ton of other herbs that we can take that can give us that stimulant.
Yeah, but it's just to realize that what we think reality is and what we think humanity and culture and world events and all that, there's a lot of these little factors stimulating people. And when you have 90% of the population consuming psychotropics every day without thinking about it, without monitoring their own dosages, without optimizing it, then it's not natural, if you will. That's the rats in the experimental cage. Where the control group?
Yep.
Where is that control group of people that aren't using any of those drugs? So anyway, so it's super fascinating to me, and I really appreciate you having me on the show. I thought
thank you.
Hard questions.
You definitely blew some minds, so I really appreciate it. And thank you as always. And maybe we'll love to have you back on and talk about personalized wellness at some point in a little more detail. So
sure, sounds great.
Thank you so much.
Everything is personal.
There you go. All right. Take care. All the best.
All right, have fun.